Is France the hidden hand behind West Africa's coup? From Niger to Mali, Burkina Faso to Chad, a series of military takeovers have rocked former French colonies. With 78% of coups happening in Francophone states since 1990, it's time to ask, is it a legacy, an inevitable outcome of French colonialism, or are there other specific causes? Niger is the latest country to join the list of West African nations where the military has seized control, following Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, and Chad, all of them former French colonies. Since 1990, nearly 80% of the 27 coups in sub-Saharan Africa have occurred in Francophone states, prompting questions about whether France or the legacy of French colonialism bears some responsibility. Many coup leaders themselves point fingers at France. Colonel Abdoulaye Maïga, named Prime Minister by the military junta in Mali in September 2022, launched a scathing attack on France, accusing it of neo-colonialist, condescending, paternalistic and vengeful policies, while alleging that France had betrayed universal moral values and stabbed Mali in the back. Burkina Faso witnessed a similar anti-French sentiment when the military government terminated a long-standing agreement allowing French troops to operate in the country, giving France 1 month to withdraw its forces. In neighboring Niger, allegations that President Mohamed Bazoum was a puppet for French interests were used to justify his removal from power. The junta, led by Gen Abdourahmane Tchani, subsequently revoked 5 military deals with France, leading to popular protests and attacks on the French embassy. While the historical record does offer some support for these grievances, as French colonial rule established systems for resource extraction and used repressive strategies to maintain control, it's important to note that other colonial powers, like the UK and the US, also propped up authoritarian leaders in their former colonies during the Cold War. British colonial rule followed a similar path, but what set France apart in Africa was the degree to which it remained involved, or as its critics argue, interfered, in the political and economic affairs of its former colonies, even after they gained independence. Out of the 9 Francophone West African states, 7 continue to utilize the CFA franc as their currency. This currency is fixed to the euro and backed by the guarantee of France, a remnant of France's economic policies in its former colonies. France also established defense agreements that frequently led to military interventions in the region. These agreements were often forged to support leaders who were aligned with French interests, regardless of their popularity or the broader democratic will of the African nations. In numerous instances, these actions bolstered the authority of corrupt and oppressive individuals, like Chad's former president Idriss Déby and former Burkinabe president Blaise Compaoré. This in turn presented further hurdles in the pursuit of democratic governance. While France did not directly engage in military interventions to reinstall the recently ousted heads of state, they were generally perceived as having pro-French leanings. Moreover, the connections between French political leaders and their African allies were frequently marred by corruption, leading to the formation of a powerful and affluent elite at the expense of the African populace. A notable French economist, François-Xavier Verschave, coined the term Francafrique to describe this neo-colonial relationship characterized by concealed criminal activities among the upper echelons of French politics and the economy. He alleged that these ties resulted in the misappropriation of significant sums of money. Despite recent efforts by French administrations to dissociate from the concept of Francafrique, persistent reminders highlight the challenging relations between France, French business interests, and Africa. This includes numerous instances of embarrassing corruption cases. These scandals were frequently overlooked or downplayed when France's African political allies held sway, and the substantial military support from France played a role in preserving stability in the region. In the past years, the capacity of France and other Western nations to maintain order has diminished, rendering them susceptible to criticism. Despite substantial funding and deploying troops, the multinational effort led by France against Islamist insurgencies in the Sahel region has proven ineffective in aiding West African governments in reclaiming authority over their territories. This aspect significantly influenced the destinies of civilian leaders in Burkina Faso and Mali, as their incapacity to safeguard their citizens fostered a perception that French support was more burdensome than beneficial. As a result, increasing public discontent and frustration empowered military leaders to believe that orchestrating a coup would garner support from the citizenry. The relationship between France and its former African colonies is a complex dynamic that encompasses political, economic, and historical aspects, and it is still currently evolving. Over the past 3 years, West Africa has witnessed a series of 5 coups, with a prevailing sentiment of antagonism towards France underlying many of these political upheavals. Those orchestrating these coups have cited France's considerable influence, notably President Emmanuel Macron's role, as a significant factor. France's substantial role in military operations and its dominance in the business landscape are central components of Macron's agenda. Notably, France maintains active military bases in Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Gabon, distinguishing it from other former colonial powers. In parallel, Macron has advocated for entrepreneurship as a paramount avenue for delivering development aid. This reflects Macron's adherence to neoliberal principles, emphasizing the virtues of free market capitalism, deregulation, and a downsizing of government expenditures to foster economic progress. But these specific dynamics currently give rise to tensions and concerns within West Africa's political landscape. Macron's shift towards neoliberal policies has shattered the enduring belief that France was a comparatively compassionate colonizer due to the cultural ties it fostered with African elites. Macron's strategy has only heightened skepticism and resentment because the significant military presence has not been substituted with a fresh global economic framework. Instead, it has been replaced with modest business agreements and the promotion of small startups. These outcomes do not align with the aspirations of African nations, contrary to their desires and expectations. Instead of a comprehensive overhaul of the economic and financial framework, Macron has advocated entrepreneurship as a means of providing development aid, with a focus on fostering startups and providing training for the youth in Africa. The primary institution for policy execution in France, Agence Française de Développement, continues to allocate resources to sectors such as education, agriculture, and infrastructure. Nevertheless, Macron's underlying message is that an increasing portion of French development assistance in Africa should be administered by French businesses, highlighting a shift in the approach to development aid. In the present day, French corporations operating in Africa have adopted a considerably more transparent stance, marking a notable departure from the secretive practices of the Françafrique era. The historical Françafrique era was characterized by behind-the-scenes dealings, where French presidents clandestinely backed African dictators to maintain their influence and interests. However, President Macron has ushered in a new era of public engagement and transparency in France's approach to Africa. Macron's public addresses regarding the African continent have undergone a substantial shift. Rather than relying on covert dealings and hidden agendas, he now openly emphasizes business initiatives and promotes the values of neoliberalism as being beneficial for the African continent. Macron's approach sends a clear message that the days of secretive backroom deals that characterized Françafrique are over. Instead, he is advocating for a more transparent, business-oriented strategy in France's engagement with Africa. Given this strategy, the sentiments among Africans haven't necessarily turned more anti-French. Instead, Macron's elevation of economics as a central pillar of his engagement with Africa aligns with a prevalent African perspective. According to this perspective, underdevelopment is often seen as a direct result of the historical dependency on European powers and persistent neo-colonial exploitation. Macron's approach, emphasizing economic engagement, inadvertently validates this perspective, contributing to the existing skepticism and frustration. By prioritizing economic engagement over other aspects of diplomacy and development, Macron's policies have inadvertently confirmed African suspicions that the true intent behind French involvement is to maintain economic control and influence. In fact, anyone who visits Dakar and interacts with its locals soon grasps a recurring sentiment. The French are primarily viewed as colonizers, with the potential for friendship taking a secondary role. What has evolved is that Macron, possibly unintentionally, has validated these African suspicions regarding his intentions. The perception is that he never genuinely aimed to transform economic structures. Instead, Africans perceive they are offered meager opportunities in the form of startup funding, akin to breadcrumbs in the broader scope of economic development. In the past, the relationship between France and its former African colonies was marked by grandiose promises of substantial structural changes and development assistance. However, these commitments often turned out to be hollow, leading to widespread disillusionment and anti-French sentiment. These promises were sometimes seen as cynical, as they failed to bring about the meaningful transformations that were expected. The result was that the fires of African instability and resentment toward French influence were stoked by this apparent betrayal of trust. Today, an intriguing shift has occurred. African leaders are now the ones pushing for significant structural changes in their nations, recognizing the need for genuine development and economic transformation. They seek to assert their country's sovereignty and break free from the perceived neo-colonial ties with Europe. Yet their aspirations for change are met with a different kind of response from France. Instead of delivering on substantial transformation, France appears to be offering smaller, business-oriented efforts. Rather than embracing grand plans for economic development and reform, it promotes entrepreneurship and startup culture as the way forward. This shift is seen by some as an attempt to maintain French influence in Africa through cost-effective means, leaving many African leaders and citizens frustrated and skeptical. As we conclude this discussion, it's crucial to reflect on the evolving dynamics between France and its former African colonies. From historical conflicts and false promises to the current emphasis on entrepreneurship, the relationship is quite complicated. What are your thoughts on how these relations and shifts may impact Africa's trajectory in the future? How can African nations assert their sovereignty while engaging in fruitful alliances? Share your insights in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on insightful discussions like this. Thank you for being a part of this important discussion.